Hello folks, Marco Landry here, and today I'm going to be documenting the process of replacing or eliminating the rear brake reservoir on my Yamaha R6. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm going to raise my foot control a little bit, and when I do so, I'll have to readjust the bracket that's holding the reservoir or cut the piece of tubing here so that's a bit shorter and will still line up properly with the bracket. So that would be option number one. But in my case, I wanted to clean this up, and since I don't use the rear brake too often, I figured that I could simply replace this with a piece of Tygon tubing. So a lot of people will call this the Superbike reservoir kit, or it's also known as the rear brake delete kit. You can call it whatever you'd like, but it's basically just a piece of tubing with a little cap on it, and you refill it with some brake fluid, and you have a much nicer look, and it's a lot easier to route this little piece of tubing than trying to attach this ugly bracket and this ugly reservoir. So if that's something of interest and you want to see how this is done, stay right there and we'll get started right now. Okay, so as I mentioned in the intro, I want to remove that rear brake reservoir, and I also want to replace the bracket. And once all of this is removed, I'll install a piece of Tygon tubing. This is a much longer section than needed, and I purchased a longer section because I did a few bikes with this. You know, the process is fairly easy. We will remove that cap here for the reservoir, and then I'll drain the liquid from that container. And after that, we'll detach that hose, and I'll plug in that piece of Tygon tubing. And after that, I have a bleeder valve or speed bleeder valve. So we'll use a speed bleeder valve to flush the system a few times. If you have the regular valve, you can do a full flush first and refill it after that. You decide what makes sense for you, but in my case, it's a lot easier if the system's already primed with a little bit of fluid in it. So that's why I'm going to leave the fluid in the hose, and I'm just going to empty the reservoir. So having said that, the other thing that you will need as well are some clips. You can use some S-band clips or some regular circular clips like this here. I have a few different options. I'll decide shortly what makes sense. And when you do this as well, you will need some brake fluid. In my case, I'm using the Motul RBF 660. So this is the .4 fluid. You can use the brand that makes sense for you. Again, I'm not saying that you need to use this. Just make sure it's a proper liquid for your bike. Obviously, you'll need a ton of paper towel or shop towel because you definitely don't want any of this brake fluid to fall on your paint, because it will certainly eat at the paint and damage your paint job. So make sure that you cover everything properly before you start this. And I got some cleaner as well. So I have this little cap here. This is the breather cap from Honda, and you can see here the part number. I'll link this in the description below. But this little cap will sit on top of your hose here, and this is what will be required in order to cap this hose properly. And in terms of the tubing, I've mentioned this earlier, this is the Tygon 2375 tubing. The internal diameter is 1/4 of an inch or 6.35 millimeter. The outer diameter is 3/8 of an inch or 9.525 millimeter. So this is what will fit on my bike. You might need a different diameter, so double check before you order your Tygon tubing. The last thing that will be needed for this is something to flush or to bleed your brake line. In my case, I'm using Mighty Vac, but again, you can use something else that makes sense for you. Okay, so the first step will be to empty that reservoir. So I'm just gonna unscrew this reservoir and remove the diaphragm. Make sure that you don't drop any fluid on your paint again. And in order to do this properly, I always like to put a rag underneath here. And as a first step, we will do a full flush of that reservoir by using the Mighty Vac. Okay, so now that the reservoir is empty, I'm simply gonna clean this up just a little bit here. Make sure that when I remove it from the bike here or undo that bolt, that there's no liquid that will drip on the paint. And now I just emptied the top part here, or I emptied the reservoir, but that little hose here is probably still full of fluid. So I'm gonna open the bleeder valve and empty this by just pumping the brake a few times, but still making sure that I have some fluid that will remain into my brake line. So in order to do this, I'm going to use my Mighty Vac again. Just plug it on this bleeder valve. And I'm just going to crack it open, and then I'll pump the brakes a few times. And again, remember that when you're doing this, the process will be different in your case if you don't have a speed bleeder valve. So I'm going to pump it just a couple of times. And now that I have some liquid that's being pumped out, I'm going to close this again here and remove the Mighty Vac. Okay, so now that this is done, I'm just going to undo this bolt here that's holding the reservoir in place. And again, be extra careful, make sure that there's no liquid that will drip anywhere. And just to be extra cautious here, I'm gonna put a little bit of paper towel in this reservoir. And now we will just unclip the little clip here that's holding this hose onto your master. And before I undo this little clip here, I'm going to put some extra shop towels underneath here and all around it, just in case there's more fluid in there. And in order to remove this, I'm simply going to push this up here, and then we will wiggle that tubing because it's been sitting there for a while, so it's probably melted a little bit on top of that, on that plastic sleeve or tube. And here we go. So now it's coming out. And here it is. So it didn't leak at all, so we're good. I'm gonna just wipe this properly. And now that it's wiped, I'm going to take a piece of Tygon tubing, and I'm going to start with a longer piece, and I'll cut it to the proper length after that. So I think that I probably have something like this here. So I'm going to cut this here, and I would normally use a really sharp blade, but the side cutters will just do that same type of job as well if they're really sharp. And you can see there's a natural curve in this tubing, so I'm going to make sure that that natural curve is curving towards the inside. And before doing this, I'll have to decide what type of clips that I want to use. So I could use some of these clips here. You can see I have different sizes, and these are just super easy to assemble. You simply press on both sides, and they stretch, and I have different sizes. Or you can use the Springbane clips, or the Springbane clamps, which I think I'm going to use these because they're a bit more solid. So you can see I have different sizes here of these spring or these banes. And I think that should be the right size here. You want this to be as close as possible to diameter, because they'll obviously stretch a bit when you slide them on. But you don't want to have something too tight that it's going to be a nightmare to put on either. So let's see if this is the right size here. Yeah, so this is the proper size here. You can see that once it's installed, it looks pretty good, and it's solid enough it won't even move. And once I slide this tubing on top of this plastic tube here, it will expand a little bit, and then this will hold everything nicely in place. So you can see it sliding on pretty easily. And I'm just going to twist it a little bit here so that it has the proper curve or bend, and it's going to be at the right location so it won't get stuck in my rear shock. And you also want to make sure that it's long enough so that you can top it up without having anything in the way. So in my case, when I top it up, I'll probably just bring it in front like this, and I have enough clearance here. So I think that's going to be the perfect length here. I was thinking that maybe I would cut it. Yeah, maybe I'll cut it just a little bit shorter. So let's properly secure this in place first. I'm just going to bring this clamp back down over the plastic tubing here coming out from the master. And actually this one is going to be too tight here, so I'm going to have to use a different size. You could also use some safety wire if you wanted to do this differently. So I've changed it now, and this is the 11 millimeter band, and the 11 millimeter is the internal diameter. So you can see now that it fits super easily on top of the hose, but it will be fairly tight when it gets on top of that little black piece of tubing coming out from the master. So now it's nice and solid, it doesn't move. I'll make sure that this is facing towards the inside of the bike so that my boots don't hit that band when I'm riding. So it's nice and solid. Just do a few tests, make sure that when you pull on it, it's nice and solid. And now I'm gonna adjust the length by just cutting it a bit more here. All right, so now that this is installed, now we're going to top it up with some fluid and start the bleeding process to make sure that brakes are okay. What I'm going to do next is I'm simply going to take my my brake fluid, and you could use a syringe if you have a syringe. I have one somewhere, but I couldn't find it. So what I did in this case, I simply puncture 2 holes in my foil here. Don't remove the full foil, just make 2 small holes, and those 2 small holes will allow the air to flow in and the liquid to flow out, and it gives you a bit better control to pour this into that small opening in that hose here. and it fills up pretty quickly, so just be extra careful. I just maybe put just a little bit too much, so I'm going to remove just a little bit so that it doesn't squirt everywhere when I try to press on the brake pedal. Okay, so now we are going to bleed the brakes again. And again, in my case, I have the speed bleeder valve, so I don't need to pump the brakes, and after that, open the bleed valve and let the fluid go out and just repeat the process. With a speed bleeder valve, it's so much easier because you simply need to crack it open, and when you press on the brake pedal, the fluid comes out. And when you're doing this, make sure that you keep an eye on the fluid in your hose as well, because you definitely don't want any air to go in. And now we're going to refill it again and push all the old fluid out, and also make sure that there's no more air pockets into your lines. I'll probably do this a couple of times, and then we will come back to install the cap on top of that hose. So when you do this, folks, just make sure that you have the proper type of tubing. This is not just any type of tubing that you'll find at your local convenience store. It has to be something that's chemically resistant, and in this case, sweat proof. So the Tygon 2375 is designed specifically for this. Okay, so having said that, we're gonna flush this a few more times, and then we will be ready to top it off with the cap from Honda. Okay, so now we are at a step where we're gonna install that breather cap from Honda, and I'm also gonna have one of these clip that will be inserted first. And this one, I took a 10 millimeter internal diameter, and we're gonna insert that breather cap. And this one is a bit trickier to install. It's a bit difficult to push in. So definitely need to be patient with this one. And the first time will be the worst, but once it's in, you're definitely all set. And now we're gonna push this little clip on top. Use the pliers for that. Right, so just make sure that the band is solid once you put it on as well. And orient the ears towards an area where they won't be caught in the body or your suspension. And once everything is done, I normally like to take some cleaner and clean all of this, just in case there was some dripping liquid that was dripping, or that could have been stuck onto the hose or some of the components. So just give it a good wipe and make sure that there's no chemicals that will impact your paint job. And also make sure that you don't forget to put the bleed cap on that nipple in the back of your bleeder valve, and then you are all set to go. So now, I guess the last thing I want to mention as well is that you will need to follow the same best practices as when you fill your reservoir. You want to make sure that there's nice air gap in that hose, that you don't fill the hose right to the top, because the liquid will expand with heat. And if it expands, obviously it will push the pistons and your caliper or your brake pads will touch the brakes, and then it will cause even more heat and therefore can jam your rear wheels. So you definitely don't want this. So make sure that you leave a little bit of air, a little bit of an air gap in that hose. And once this is done, normally I just put it underneath here, and that's it. You're done, guys. That's the process to install the rear brake delete kit on your motorcycle. So the process will be similar for most bikes out there. I'm doing this on my R6. The process was the same on my R3. The size of tubing might vary from bike to bike, so double check to make sure that you have the proper size of tubing. But other than that, that's it. That's the process. And do not forget to leave a small air pocket or air gap at the top of your tubing. Hopefully that video was helpful. If it was, please do me a favor and smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like. And if you have any questions, comments, feedback, please connect with me on social media or post your comments below. I'm always happy to connect with you folks. And until next time, stay safe, ride safe, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.